we can observe that American democracy was very peculiar. That American democracy was closer, perhaps, to democracy. I'm borrowing the term from Plato's Republic, and democracy is the rule of the rich. And on the other hand, Joe Biden, in his outgoing speech addressed to the Congress, said that America is an oligarchy. And this is the most dangerous thing, that that freedom and basic rights are threatened by tech industrial complex. And this is exactly what we can see at the moment. But of course, in American history, we had all sorts of presidents, and I'm not sure if Richard Nixon was a good president. I'm not sure if George Bush and his son, George W. Bush, were the best American president. Was Bill Clinton a good president? What is the difference between the America from 2 or 3 decades ago and the present day America? Can we protect ourselves against American populism, against Pied Pipers who enchant the masses and lead us into destruction? So these are the questions that we are trying to answer today. Of course, we won't give you a detailed roadmap. What we are going to do is to show you, is to demonstrate to you some ways of resistance and perhaps some ways for new development that we as Europeans need. I wanted to invite Professor Tadeusz Sławek to give a brief talk about his perception of the present situation in the United States. Let's give Professor Sławek a big hand.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Thank you very much, Pavel, for the introduction. I'm not sure whether I have any answers, and I think that the main point of my talk would be to concentrate on Europe. As a matter of fact, Professor Marcinkiewicz used this concept of Europe and asked a question about us Europeans several times. So I think I'll be heading in that direction, of course, remembering about Pavel's admonition that I have to be brief. So let's say about 30, maybe 35 minutes at most. Well, welcome, first of all. A beautiful day has risen in Opole. I hope the day is equally beautiful everywhere where people have come to listen to this event. And my basic question is, where do we stand now? I don't have anything written that I will be reading out at you. No, I'll be just improvising, using bits and pieces of my notes. So the big question is, where do we stand now after we've been devastated by the COVID, by the war in Ukraine, by various problems associated with artificial intelligence, job market being in the state of dramatic change, and of course Trump's access to power in America. So my question will be, where do we stand? I'm trying to understand the anxieties that have been imposed upon our minds, particularly upon minds of young people, asking themselves precisely about the position in which we are and the possible future ahead of us. So we've been thrown, most generally speaking, we've been thrown into confusion. We find ourselves in a very precarious situation, in a situation of a certain quandary where we don't seem to know where we are going. And I think one of the basic issues ahead of us, and I'm asking it on behalf of you, my young friends who would be actually ruling this world and the affairs of this world very, very soon, sooner than you think. What is the fate and what is the role of freedom and what we really mean by freedom? And the question is, to what extent the anxiety which we are living today, or under the pressure of which we live today, deprives us of the joy of living. Let me remind you that in Anglo-Saxon, the word freo, which is the source of freedom, is also stands for joyful. Freo means free and joyful. To be free is to enjoy living, is to enjoy life. So I'm questioning the issue of, I'm trying to address the issue of whether or not it is possible for us Europeans to reclaim the joy of living. And it's actually a one-time event, as you know. There will be no another life, considering the dramatic circumstances. And since we are, in fact, at the university, particularly in the humanities, we deal with texts. So I was trying to find some kind of illustration of our situation in various texts. And one of these texts comes from actually both of them come from the later parts of 19th century. And one of these illustrations goes back to Lewis Carroll, but not Lewis Carroll of Alice in Wonderland, but Lewis Carroll of The Hunting of the Snark. In 1876, Carroll published this wonderful poem about a group of indomitable travelers hunting this monster called the Snark. But this is of no interest to us. What interests us today is the map which they are using. And I think it's a perfect illustration of where we are now, because if we had more time, we would, of course, I would be able to offer a longer quotation. We are pressed for time. So actually the map they are using is perfect and absolute blank. And that's due to our brave captain, as you think. So they are traveling, but their map is totally blank. They have lost the sense of direction. They have lost the sense of where the tropics are. Where they have lost the sense of Mercator, of zones, of poles, nothing. Their map is completely blank. And I think this is a very good illustration of where we are now. And that's partly one of the sources of the anxiety. On a more serious level, in a more serious way, actually, very shortly after Carroll's poem, we have a more dramatic statement of the same situation. I'm talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, who only a few years later than Hunting of the Snark publishes his book Joyful Wisdom. Interesting title, Joyful Wisdom, Fröhliche Wissenschaft. And in the aphorism of 125, which I believe ought to be an obligatory material for any university course, particularly in the humanities, the madman, the tolle Mensch, proclaims the death of God. Now that is a tremendous problem. We are not going to approach this. That's a topic of another discussion, certainly. What is interesting for us today is the consequences of this event. And the consequences are, again, very similar to those that I listed a minute ago. Let me quote from the English translation of this passage. So what is the consequence of the death of God? Or as Nietzsche says, of loosening the earth from the sun. Okay. What is the consequence? The consequence is the general fall, situation of the general fall of humanity. I'm quoting. Where does Earth move now? Where do we move? Away from all suns? Do we not dash on unceasingly, backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still any above, any below? Do we not stray, excuse me, as through infinite nothingness, etc., etc., etc.? This question, is there any left, is there any right? Is there above, is there below? These are very serious questions referring to the situation in which we find ourselves now, particularly after Trump has decided to adopt such an attitude towards Europe and the rest of the world, generally speaking. Now, Nietzsche finally asks himself a question: how shall we console ourselves? But I believe, and I would like to raise an argument with Nietzsche here, that we don't need a consolation, we don't need a solace, we need some action. We need activity, we need recalibration of our thinking, and particularly a recalibration of our university, education, the university, secondary schools, of course, as well. So the recalibration of thinking, reconfiguration of education, also university education, is what is at stake here. This is, of course, also followed, so that these would be my two illustrations, okay, describing the situation of the quandary or the confusion in which we have been thrown by all these factors, the last of which is Trump's ideological clampdown upon education, freedom, freedom of speech, etc., 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 etc. Point number 3 would be, what can we expect under the circumstances? Again, and I think it's an important thing, and I'm trying to bring this truth somehow to you, my young friends, that we should not be afraid of old texts, because in many of these old texts, we find commentary which helps us to live with and to deal with, to cope with our problems, our quandaries today. Roughly speaking, about the same time, mid-19th century, a classic of liberal democracy, John Stuart Mill, a great English thinker, also debates the issue of democracy in Europe and helps us to, and comes to our rescue, comes with some kind of help by sketching 2 helpful remarks. Remark number 1 is that what we can expect in the process of history is that European history and humanity has the tendency to develop along such a course that worse replaces better. So in other words, with all due respect to human ingenuity, to human achievements, to human virtues, we have to remember that there is the other side of humanity, which speaks about destruction, which speaks about corruption, which speaks about injustice, etc., etc., etc. He says, there is a general tendency of things throughout the world is to render mediocrity the ascendant power over mankind. The course of history, Mill seems to be telling us, is that mediocrity replaces ingenuity, or at least has a strong ambition to replace ingenuity and authenticity. And I think what happened in America in November and what is happening in America today is a great example of that, of how worse replaces good, how mediocrity replaces authenticity, and so on and so forth. Why is this so? Point number 2 from Mill. This is so because, as he says, This is due to the present low state of the human mind. Low state of the human mind, says Mill. In other words, there is something, shall I say, wrong? Or there is something, let's be more diplomatic, there is something less adequate or not adequate in the way in which we educate ourselves. There is no, the education has become merely the way of acquiring professional skills rather than working towards, as Mill says, human mind. And later on he says, he speaks about mental vigor and moral courage. This is what we need. We need to work in education. Of course, we need professional training. We all know this, and we all have to acquire professional skills. But education is something much more than this. It deals with the quality of human mind. It deals with us acquiring, as Mill says, mental vigor, intellectual alertness, intellectual curiosity, and, as he says, moral courage, the ability to speak out on behalf of justice, and you name it. What it means, what it implies for Mill, it also implies that we need to, and I would like you to pay attention to this word, because this is the word that Mill, once again, the classic of liberal democracy, uses. He uses the word eccentric. Worthwhile people, the people with moral courage, the people with dignified human mind, with people with mental vigor, are eccentric people. What does it mean? That is to say, eccentric, that is to say, able to say no, able to oppose if they think that vital issues are at stake. This idea of eccentricity, I think, is crucial, because if we don't, because this is, of course, the result of these abilities which we ought to cultivate. Once again, quality of human mind, moral courage, and mental vigor, mental alertness, mental curiosity, being able to indulge in intellectual pursuits. This is, I believe, what eccentricity means, and the final result of this is the ability to say no, is the ability to protest against things which we consider vitally important for us. Interestingly enough, this is, of course, what is happening, for example, in America today. I'm looking at March the 10th, a very recent issue of the New Yorker, where you'll find a very long article illustrating the situation of American universities, also the elite universities, that is to say 8 Ivy League universities like Yale, Harvard, and of course they are all under pressure of new administration that threatens them with cutting down budgets if these universities insist on DEI policies, that is to say on the policies which accentuates democracy, D, equality, E, and inclusion, I. These are the 3 enemies of the present American administration as far as universities are concerned. Universities and professors and students, for that matter, who are definitely positioned as enemies, definitely positioned as dangerous elements, which somehow from within corrode the brilliant, inverted commas, of course, the brilliant American tradition, whatever it means. Hence, I'm quoting, on the one hand, you have outside funders, including the federal governments, who have the ability to threaten the university's abilities to operate because of the funding. Harvard itself obtains $700 million a year for research. So no university is able to survive such cuts, of course. So that's one side. The other side is, on the other, you have the mission of the institution. And the mission university is the pursuit of knowledge. These two things do not agree with each other. So it's a difficult problem. It's a very difficult situation in which we are now, and evidently it implies all these problems implicate us in a question about education, surely. And I think that we've already proclaimed or professed this issue that education is certainly deals with professional skills. Certainly, that's undeniable. But also, it's much more than this. And I'm quoting from Gerd Bista, who is the leading philosopher as far as education is concerned, and who says, "Education is not about insertion of the individual into the existing order. So education is not about training you into conformism and into being able to support uncritically, of course, the status quo. It's not about this. Education entails an orientation towards autonomy and freedom. So what is at stake today is autonomy or freedom. So if we want to ask ourselves a question about Europe and its future, and my initial question was, are we able to reclaim the joy of living in Europe, considering the severe circumstances at the moment? So if this is our point, if we are to reclaim the Freude of Europe, if we are to reclaim the jouissance, as the French says, of Europe, so we need to recalibrate the education and to actually match the professional skills which we train at the universities. And this is our undeniable task, surely, but we need to match it with, I'm quoting Mill, working on moral courage, intellectual curiosity, etc., etc., etc. Now, I'll be slowly closing down, and let me close this down with reference to a philosopher who I think is a great philosopher for difficult times, and I think we are living through difficult times now. Spinoza, the Jewish Dutch philosopher who dies 1677, so we are talking mid-17th century, has a few things. I'm thinking about four very practical pieces of advice which I find in Spinoza's political treatise, which he was not able to finish before he died. He didn't manage to finish it. But nevertheless, I'm trying also to persuade you not to be afraid of big names, because if you hear names like Kant, Spinoza, you say, oh my God, how boring, how difficult. They could function on this level, sure. But also if you can fish out for something which is practical, you'll be able to find it in them. So I fished out four practical pieces of advice of how to be on the way. I'm not saying how to reclaim joy. That's more distant, but how to be on the way towards reclaiming joy of living in Europe, okay? Point number one, I'm quoting, I have labored carefully not to mock, not to lament, not to execrate, but to understand human actions. Full stop. I mean, this is a very striking remark. Our job everywhere, but at the university primarily so, is not to mock, not to lament, not to condemn, but first of all, to understand. Now, this question of understanding is absolutely crucial. I think that what Spinoza has translated into the 21st century discourse is telling us, people, you have learned how to acquire information, more information, the faster the better. But you've lost the ability to slow down and try to understand what this means. Now, this is, of course, something worth thinking about. And this remark is, of course, my opening advice, which I find in Spinoza, because I think it opens the gate and paves the way for everything else that follows. Okay, so we need to work on understanding, and that is the first step. So we are not data collectors, because we've been turned into data collectors, let's face it. I mean, you scroll and scroll and scroll. Now, that's not the point. The point is to understand what's happening under the surface of these phenomena. So that's my first piece of advice. Second piece of advice. Of course, we all live in political world, surely, and we need politicians, absolutely. We should not be dreaming the dream of a politician-free world. That's not going to happen. But Spinoza is telling us that, I'm quoting, politicians plot against mankind rather than consult their interests. Now, that's a tremendously important statement. Of course, sooner or later, most politicians, let's be more careful about that. Sooner or later, most politicians, you will see that if you look carefully, if you try to understand, you will see that sooner or later, most politicians will reveal themselves as those who plot against mankind by giving false promises, for example, okay? Rather than serve the interests of humanities. Politicians are crafty, as Spinoza says in the English translation, okay? And this is a warning, because we need to carefully study the messages and decisions of these people who hold the dominion, in order to be able to see very carefully through the promises, through what they say, and not just accepting what their pronouncement on the surface value. So that's the second practical piece of advice which I find in this brilliant 17th century thinker. Advice number 3, again, quotation first. For men are not born for citizenship, but must be made so. Now, that's another tremendously important statement. Nobody is born a citizen. You become a citizen slowly, step by step, day by day, year by year. Till you die, you are working towards becoming a citizenship. Being a conscious citizen is a tremendously responsible work. And this is, of course, a direct call for education. Education ought to help people working towards becoming citizens rather than independent, self-contained, self-sufficient individuals working exclusively for his or her advantage and well-being. And of course, this, of course, is a great call for working and helping people work upon all kinds of associations, non-governmental organizations, communities, and so on and so forth. It's also a warning against people like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg, who offer you false sociability by so-called social platform. So, my third piece of advice is do not stop on working towards being a citizen. And that's, of course, a great responsibility of education, which I think we have largely neglected. Fourth and the last, again, let's start with a quotation from Spinoza, mid-17th century, mind you. The gravest mistake, sorry, where's that? Okay, this is a quote. The Commonwealth, that is to say the Republic, the state, the society, whose peace depends on the sluggishness of its subjects, that are led about like a sheep to learn but slavery may more properly be called a desert than a commonwealth. Now, that's a very critical observation. He says that you have no right to call yourself a society if you allow yourself to be uncritically led by the nose, by your nose, by politicians. In this way, you become a slave, rather, and the society stops being a society and is rather a desert. It's not a commonwealth, it's a desert. So if you remain uncritical, you from inside destroy your own society. From inside, you corrode what makes us live together. And this ability, this war cry, do not be sheep. I mean, you can translate it into modern discourse. Go back home, search for a Pink Floyd album, Animals, 1987, if I remember well. And then you will find a song called Sheep. Hopelessly passing your time in the grassland away, only dimly aware of a certain unease in the air, you better watch out. There may be dogs about. Things are not what they seem. This warning, that's Spinoza translated into modern discourse, into the language of rock and roll, if you like. Do not be a sheep. If you are a sheep, you destroy the very heart of human society. Remember the word eccentric in John Stuart Mill's mid-19th century essay on liberty? This is exactly this. Eccentric, that is to say, someone who is not a sheep, who does not belong to a herd of sheep. And these four pieces of advice, which I find in the 17th century thinker, could be, possibly, could make sort of an opening for us and could put us on the way towards possibly sometime in the future reclaiming the Freude, the jouissance, the joy of living together in Europe. That's all up to you. We are moving out. The floor is yours. Not only for discussion, but first of all, for action. Okay, half an hour, thank you.
And now it's time for questions, and Professor Sławek will be very glad to ask your questions connected with philosophy, with Spinoza or other philosophers, or in other practical aspects connected with eccentricity of academic development, which is, as we've learned, a crucial point in becoming a full citizen. And I think that this is the most important. This was the most important point in Professor Sławek's lecture. We have to become full citizens via education that develops our eccentricity. So the floor is yours.
I can promise I can take questions, but I can't promise I'll answer them. Feel free, ask anything you wish.
So if I may, because we already have two questions from the audience online, but I see the chat is muted, so Professor Marcinkiewicz, if you can unmute the...
I did. We are muted the chat. Okay. Now I unmuted the chat. So the questions will be read, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, I will read it. Or we can also display it at this screen. So can you hear me, participants online? If you can confirm, thank you, Mita.
Now we have a Q&A question to Professor Sławek, and we have two questions in a chat of the meeting. The first one, Professor, if Trump's second term leads to further economic protectionism or trade wars, what philosophical frameworks might help us understand the potential long-term impacts on global economic justice, especially for the most vulnerable nations in Europe? Should I ask another question?
Sure.
Okay, so the second question is, what can the educational institutions do to nurture citizens and citizenship? How do we go about greening the desert?
Mm-hmm. Your first question is a fairly nuanced one. That is to say, you're asking about long-term perspective on, for example, trade wars that are being now announced or are just in the offing, so to speak. And of course, it's largely answerable on the level of economics, which I'm not sure I can handle very professionally. From what it seems to be is that very awkward decisions concerning trade wars, Trump's policies vis-à-vis Mexico or vis-à-vis Canada, for example, or vis-à-vis Europe, and now I think yesterday it was vis-à-vis everybody, in fact, seems to be unproductive, that is to say, or counterproductive, because I believe it may, all these factors may result in lowering rather than helping the standard of living within America itself. I don't think that the egg crisis in America is already a result of this. That's too soon, of course, but we've read about the lack of eggs. Eggs are in hard demand in America at the moment. I don't think it's one of the effects already. That's too soon. But very soon it may turn out that it could be actually dramatically counterproductive for the USA itself. I think on the level of, on the political level, I think what it boils down to is, I think it's a demonstration, is a very aggressive demonstration of a certain political ambition of Donald Trump and his administration. And the aim of this ambition is to, as the slogan goes, make America great again, but on a very simplistic level. This slogan is understood on a very simplistic level, which I think may eventually collapse under its own weight for economic reasons, for political reasons, and many other reasons. I think also part of the story behind all kinds of policies, I think, in the present American administration is narcissistic cult that Donald Trump has of himself, and his actually desire for success. And his desire for success is very loosely, the success itself is very loosely understood. So what seems to be for him today success, eventually in 2-3 months' time could turn out to be a total failure. He may negotiate some kind of peace deal with Ukraine in order to, with Russia rather, in order to proclaim tremendous success, but in 2 or 3 months' time, this success will turn out to be a total flop and disaster. So I think the situation, one of the problems which most critics and commentators emphasize, the main problem with the present American administration is its unpredictability. And since you started your question with long-range perspective, I think American present-day administration has no long-range perspectives at all. That would be my estimate. But of course, your question calls for a much more detailed economic analysis, which I will not be able to offer. Your other question about citizenship and education for citizenship, this is, of course, a very, very wide field, and very many aspects come as important agents in this field. I think that basically all decent efforts which you put into what 19th century Mill defined as moral courage and pursuit of knowledge and so on. So all these elements come into play when it comes to formulate the idea of citizenship as an actor. I think, to cut long story short, I think what is at stake in this is to avoid being a schizoid man. You remember that the concept of schizoid man was introduced largely in the early 20th century. And of course, it's complicated, but it boils down to the idea that schizoid man is a man who is not able to relate socially with anybody else except himself. That's, of course, a very crude definition, but I think for the time being, it will have to suffice. So, in other words, good citizenship avoids, or at least is working towards avoiding the situation of someone who's locked up in the image of his own success, in the image of his own monadic world, and so on and so forth. So I think this is largely what we suffer from today. We are all locked in all kinds of isolated fields of interest, social platforms, interest groups, and so on and so forth. But the interrelationship between these groups is minimal. And in fact, this is a very schizoid situation, in fact. So I think good citizenship works against the schizoid trauma of someone who is critically unable to enjoy social relationships. Okay, that will be about it. Sorry. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Professor. We have 7 more questions. I don't know if we have time and space to address all of them.
I think 7 more questions are 5 too much.
Okay.
But I don't know how we decide which questions we choose. All of them. Okay.
Maybe
let's try
shortest.
Could you please read the next question?
Okay. So the next question is, what can we do ourselves to nurture our own minds? The second, why is it so important what people think? And maybe the third one, because they are not very, they do not probably require a long answer. So the third one, Trump has been elected and his policies are supported by many people in his country and also elsewhere, including Europe. This is commentary. And the question, how to engage in productive dialogue with Trump's supporters?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, the last one is really dramatic. I think that I'll try to answer 3, or at least address the 3 questions as one, because I think that the common denominator for all 3 of them is the way in which we approach language. I think it's not a coincidence that, remember, one of the first, if not the first, move of Donald Trump was official in the White House, in the limelight, signing the executive order renaming Denali Mount McKinley and renaming Mexican Bay American Bay. And I think it was not a coincidence, because Donald Trump knows how important language is. And he knows that who owns the language owns people who use this language. Now, this is old truth. You read Lewis Carroll, the great philosopher and the great writer, Lewis Carroll. You read Alice in Wonderland, you read Through the Looking Glass, and you know that there is a character called Humpty Dumpty, and Humpty Dumpty illuminates Alice upon the nature of language. And then knowledge of and the wisdom of Humpty Dumpty is the words mean what I want them to mean. Okay? Now, this is the truth of any propaganda. And Donald Trump knows this. It was not a coincidence that his first executive order was the renaming, 2 actions of renaming. And I'm mentioning this because one of the instructions, particularly vis-a-vis the third question, how to discuss with Trump's people, would be not to be misled into taking what they say in the face value, on the level of on the surface level, so to speak. And I think, of course, this is a message which is important for universities and for humanities, particularly because we are working in language. And I think it's vitally important to pay a lot of attention to the language we use. And of course, you can, at that particular moment, ask yourselves, I'm addressing it particularly to this question to you, young people, our young friends, to what extent you are the victims of your own invention? To what extent you have produced these politicians who debate the most important issues of this world on Twitter in 144 signs through your attachment to these social platforms and so on and so forth. So in other words, we need to look, we need to go outside the social platform as the message of social communication. We need to recover the sense of human debate and human conversation, not via communicators, okay? And we need to, because this will bring us back to the importance of the words as locked in people's bodies, in people's faces, in people's gestures, in what they mean, in what they behave, in how they behave, and so on and so forth. So I think this, and that also will open us to the nuance, because I think one of the critical situations of modern politics is that we have lost the sense of nuance, the sense of detailed analysis, the delicacy of human thinking, which has all kind of nuances, have all kinds of shades. This is to a considerable extent, we have lost this ability to differentiate between various levels of meaning of particular words and sentences and so on and so forth. So I think one of the possible ways of addressing this issue would be do not neglect language and listen carefully to what people say, and try to, Spinoza advice number one, try to understand before you condemn, before you laugh, before you scorn. Try to understand first what it means to understand carefully, slowly. I think in the act of what the German language would probably call Nachdenklichkeit, try to slowly understand what these people are saying, although they may be not saying it aloud, but what is there hidden in what they are trying to communicate. Now, this was evident. I mean, Vance's speech in Munich was a classic example of that. How, speaking about values, he was eliminating all values. Now, we need to listen to this, analyze this, and be aware of this. Sorry about that. I have not answered all these questions, but I was trying to find some kind of common point in all three of the issues that you raised. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll have to move probably.
Well, we have these were questions asked online, and we have a few questions from the room.
Dzień dobry, nazywam się Oskar Tomala, jestem studentem filologii angielskiej. Yes, I'm sorry. So my name is Oskar Tomala. I'm studying English philology, and I wanted to ask, Donald Trump represents the right-wing party, the right-wing views, and his election for the for the president means that the majority is in favor of the right-wing views, right-wing policies. And my question is, does it does it mean that there is a sort of trend toward right-wing party or right-wing views in general? Like the second part of this question is how does it refer to your lecture? How does it refer to the values and the philosophy in general?
If I understood your question correctly, although it's not a remark addressed at you, but only addressed at the acoustics of this room, which is not very clear, I think. But if I understood your question correctly, you're asking about whether or not we are witnessing the general turn towards right-wing politics in the world. Okay. And I think, yes, this is true. You may look at it from different different perspectives. Of course, one of the perspectives is what Mill in mid-19th century said, that on the whole, if you look at human history, you may find out that there are moments in human history which demonstrate that worse replaces good, worse replaces better. I'm not saying that right-wing politics by definition have to be bad or evil. I'm saying that simply that we have to very carefully ask ourselves the question: what are the roots of such a phenomenon? Okay, what is the source of this popularity of what you were describing as right-wing politics? One of the reasons could be that if you go towards an extreme version of any kind of politics, but if you push it very, very, very hard, like, for example, what happened to so-called political correctness, okay? If you push it very hard, turning it into some kind of maybe even left-wing fundamentalism, it will certainly produce a backlash. It will certainly produce a blowback from the right-wing politics, which would be equally fundamentalist. So in other words, what we need to think about, and that's also partly an answer to the previous question about how to debate with Trump's people and people who voted for Trump. And part of this issue would be that we need to probably reclaim, and many people say this so, we need to reclaim the virtue which in Aristotle, another great name, another dangerous name. Don't be afraid of Aristotle. You'll find many interesting things in Aristotle. Anyway, Aristotle's notion of phronesis, that is to say, some kind of common sense, reasonability, if you wish. So we need to find this phronetic ability to avoid extremes, so to speak. Because if one extreme on the one side will produce certainly a backlash from the other end of the spectrum, which is equally fundamentalist, equally dangerous, and equally ugly. Okay, so in other words, that would be possibly, and that is precisely what Donald Trump is reacting to. Remember, if he repeals the policies of DEI, that is to say democracy, equality, inclusion, he does it because he's actually, at least in his own opinion, he claims that it's gone too far. Okay, some of his judgments are ridiculous, of course, but nevertheless, his opinion is that this has gone too far, and now it needs to be, inverted commas, corrected. So that would be my response to your first question. And your other question was about education, is that right? Could you rephrase your other question?
Well, the second part was, how does it refer to your lecture, to the philosophy?
In two ways, I think. One, I was trying. One of them is what I have been trying to do this morning. That is, I was trying partly, although that was not my main objective, But indirectly, I was trying to advertise big names and advertise them in the sense that, of course, there is an opinion of being difficult attached to their production, as of opinion of them being hermetic writers, full of sophisticated and hermetic terminology, which may be to a certain extent true. But if you try to understand, once again, Spinoza advice number 1, they will be able to teach you many practical things too. So that was my first purpose and my first way of reacting to your question. And the second way, or the other way of reacting to your question, would be that, of course, I was addressing these issues in such a way which I think, at least in my imagination, in my vision of it, would make these issues important for you. That you would find these issues perhaps partly academic. Yes, there's nothing wrong with this, but partly deep inside the issues which concern your own life. Although you may be trying to distance yourself from them, claiming that your life is basically somewhere else and so on and so forth. But deep inside, the question of joy, the question of responsibility, the question of freedom is what makes you go. It is what makes you begin each day, although we may not be aware of it all the time. But that was my other, if you like the word mission, that was my other mission for today. To make you alert of what happens in you, at least in my imagination. I may be totally wrong. If so, then start throwing things at me. I don't know. But I was trying to make you aware of the fact that the academic discourse is not totally building castle in the air. That academic discourse could actually touch you to the quick, okay? There is such a beautiful Polish expression, dotknąć do żywego, okay? This is what happens when, in old times, when dentists didn't use anesthetics. It is what happened when the dentist's hand slipped and touched them. This is it. This is what I was trying to do, but I may have failed totally. I'm not sure. Okay, anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. I think it's a good moment to move to Mainz. Professor Mity Banerjee is waiting with her brief presentation, and then we will have more. After Professor Mita's presentation, we'll have a short break again, and then we'll have another question session. And I think those of you who couldn't ask a question to Professor Sławek now will be able to do it in half an hour or so. So, Professor Mity Banerjee from the Obama Institute at the University of Mainz. Let's give her a big hand.
So, thank you so much. I'm trying the technology. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
so
perfect.
I will start by saying I'm really excited about this event. I'll screen share in a moment. Maybe I'll start the screen sharing now, okay? Because that's my most difficult part. Okay, and I can only do one thing at a time. So I will do that. Okay. Okay. Okay, I was told I need to wait till you see the presentation. Do you see the presentation yet?
Yes, we do.
Yes. We do.
Okay,
It's
I'm
great.
excited. I'm very excited about that. And now this part. Do you see it in the presentation mode? Or do you still see? Okay, I was also taught to wait. Do you see it in the presentation mode yet? Okay, I'll give it.
No,
okay,
Not yet.
I'll give it. I'll talk slowly and give it a little bit more time. Okay. Because if I click it too many times, this is to Christine in Mainz. Do you think I should re-click it? Okay, let's see. I'll try again. Do you see it now?
Now we can
Yes,
see it, Mita.
now we have the
Yes.
presentation.
Okay. So that was the most difficult part. So I'm very excited to be here. I practiced my Polish, and all I can say is dzień dobry, which I'm not sure if that's understandable. So I'm very excited about this event. Very grateful to Professor Marcinkiewicz and Professor Sławek for doing this with us, for having the JGU be in Poland. And also I'm grateful to Dr. Nicole Bierkle, who organized this whole event on the Mind side. And so I'm actually excited because even though Professor Sławek and I talked about what we were going to say, of course, we didn't know exactly what we were going to say. So I actually am ending up in a very similar place. So I'm also asking, what can we do as scholars, as people, in scholarship, in the humanities, but also at the university to make sense of this situation? So I'm excited about this joint event. And I want to actually say that for them as an alliance, and there's people in this electronic room from, all over the world, essentially, all over Europe. I think for them has never been more important because actually as Europeans, we have to make sense of the situation. And more than ever, it's about how we as Europeans can actually join forces. And I think this is really what this event is about and which, makes me so thrilled about it. So what I want to do in this talk, I want to ask, as an Americanist, I want to ask, what can we do as Americanists in Germany and in Poland, but also simply as scholars in many different fields, because it's a challenge not just for us as scholars, but also for us as people. And I think it impacts us in very specific ways. And that's what I would like to talk about today. And I'm using a method which is called Transnational American Studies, which basically means that what we are doing as Americanists in Europe is not just sort of a bad copy of what the real Americanists are doing in the US, but it's really more important than ever because Fishkin once said, this is in 2004, she said what matters is also how the US is seen in other parts of the world. So that's a truly dialogic way of conceiving of American studies. And I think more than ever, it matters what we think as Europeans and how we make sense of these changes. And so this is my experiment today. I want to look at the genealogy of how we got here. But I'm not a political scientist. I'm not an economist. So I'm looking at cultural texts, texts from popular culture that may tell us something about social change. And okay. I'm watching the chat, but I'm not trying to get distracted. So Sigrid Krakauer, who's a German philosopher, once said that cultural texts are like seismographs. They tell us about social changes even before these changes actually happen. So this is what I want to do today. And I want to ask, how did it come to the current polarization of society in the US, which is certainly also there in Germany? So in Germany, society is also polarized. There's two completely opposing fractions. And I want to say, when did we get there? When did that begin? And how can we overcome that? And I'll spoil my conclusion. I don't have an answer. I wish I did. So please bear with me. So I want to go back in time, and I want to start with one specific text. And this text was called Roots. It was a novel written in 1976 by a journalist and writer, Alex Haley. It was then adapted as a TV miniseries. I'll talk about that in a second. And actually, Roots told the story of Kunta Kinte, a man who was, born in Africa, in Gambia, and who was then kidnapped into slavery. And this text, Roots, talks about his life. It talks about his life and that of his children and grandchildren. And it actually changed overnight the way that people thought about slavery and the way that people thought about race. And I wanted, if all goes well, I want to show you a short clip from a recent adaptation of Roots. Okay, and I'm holding my breath to see if this works. Okay, start now. Do you hear the sound?
Your name first. You are Kunta Kinte, son of Omora and Binta Kinte. You must always honor your ancestors. The ones who love you and watch over you. It's time your family pay Kunta. Run! Oh! Jump! Jump!
I own this property, boy, and everything on it.
There is no South without slavery.
But God is my witness. I say you, even if he part you tomorrow, your love, it will never die.
A name is who you is. My daddy took whippings night and day to protect his name.
Speak to me, Lord! Speak to me, Lord!
You think I don't know him, my daddy?
If you ever touch just one, I'll kill you.
Your bold is about.
So this novel and then the TV adaptation changed the way that people thought about slavery. And importantly, it was called The Saga of an American Family. It wasn't called The Saga of a Black American Family. It said this is an American family. This is the father, his children, and his grandchildren. And the novel starts with Kunta's birth, how his parents in Gambia were so hopeful about their son's life, about how this was a very prestigious family, and how everything was destroyed by slavery. And the text was adapted as a miniseries. So this was way before the era of streaming, of course. So on 8 consecutive nights, the entire nation watched to see the story of Kunta Kinte unfold. And it actually changed the way that people thought about slavery, because slavery was no longer abstract, but it really brought home what the horror of slavery meant. So this was after the civil rights movement, but even that remained abstract to many people. And this series brought home what slavery meant for actual people. And so that story changed the way that whites thought about race, that whiteness was thought about in relation to slavery. So for the first time, whiteness was now associated with shame and guilt, because people said, if these were my ancestors that did that, that's horrible. I don't want to live in a history like that. So what happened was that now people thought differently about whiteness, and actually they wanted to stop being white. So for the first time in history, they wanted to quit the melting pot. And so what happened was, throughout American history so far, American history had been the melting pot, right? So immigrants would jump into the melting pot, then somebody would stir, right? And then you would melt and become white. Except this Irishman who sort of sticks out because, the Irish were hard to melt. People said they were still ethnic. But what happened now is that nobody wanted to be white, because being white meant that your ancestors were responsible for slavery. And so the reverse process happened. People wanted to get out of the melting pot, and they no longer wanted to be white. And how did they do that? They actually discovered their ethnic ancestors. So people would go into the attic and they would discover a letter written by the Italian grandmother. Okay, so overnight, they became Irish Americans and they became Italian Americans. And nobody wanted to be just white. And Matthew Fry Jacobson, who's a historian, has written a book about this, about the so-called white ethnics. And he said the book is called Roots 2. So basically, Alex Haley wrote Roots, and they said this is the history of slavery. And then these white ethnic people were basically saying, we're ethnic too. We're not white. So by becoming white ethnics, they actually escaped the guilt of slavery, because they said, my ancestors, they were not white. And they never did what we saw in this TV series and read in this novel. Okay. Now I have 4 short parts, and they're all very short. So I wanted to show you one example of how this white ethnicity worked. And the example I want to show you is Rocky, which is also made in 1976. So Rocky, and I want to, I can't do a show of hands because I'll lose time, but I'm not sure how many of you still know Rocky, but this is the original Rocky 1. So Rocky Balboa is an Italian American. So he is a white ethnic and he's an underdog. He's poor. He lives in a white neighborhood, works on a meat factory, can't really afford box training. And he wants to become a boxer and he challenges the champion. The champion is Apollo Creed and he's African American and he's part of the establishment. So the implication in this Rocky film is that now after the civil rights movement, the establishment is Black. So the African American champion, Apollo Creed, has everything. He has management. He has, a lot of money. The media are on his side. So it's a very, we would say today, a very problematic implication to say that after the civil rights movement, Blacks are in power and whites, including white ethnics, have now become the underdogs. And you can see that Apollo Creed is actually, the name is telling, right? He's a god, and the creed of America is now Black, and he is wearing the stars and stripes. So this movie is actually saying the sides have been reversed, and now whites are in the minority, and white ethnics, are the underdogs. And that's a small clip that I want to show you from that. Okay, again, hoping it works.
Rising up, back on the street. Did my time, took my chances. Went the distance, now I'm back on my feet. Just a man and his will to survive. So many times it happens too fast. You trade your passion for glory. Don't lose your grip on the dreams of the past. You must fight just to keep them alive. It's the eye of the tiger, the thrill of the fight, rising up to the challenge of our rival. And the last known survivor stalks his prey in the night, and he's watching us all with the eye of the tiger.
Okay. So as you saw in the clip, the media is on Apollo's side, right? So Apollo is wearing a suit. He's the champion. And at the beginning, nobody is on Rocky's side. The establishment is all Black. That's what the film implies. And actually, as viewers, we're invited by this film to side with Rocky. We want Rocky to win. We want the white ethnic underdog to win. And so now what is important is that there's a clash between what is portrayed as the Black establishment and the white ethnics who the film argues, don't really have a voice and need to find their voice. So the implication is that Blacks have become the elite because they have everything. And Rocky is now the underdog, the Italian American. But that is, of course, a very specific, we would say, ideology, right? I mean, it's not saying after the civil rights movement, we know that poverty still persisted in African American neighborhoods. This was later on the beginning of mass incarceration. So not that much has changed. But the film says that it's now white people, white ethnics, who have become the underdogs. Okay. This is my third part, and there's only 4. And there's an experiment at the end. Okay. So then Rocky is an example of how people actually quit the melting pot, right? Because nobody wanted to be white anymore. And Italian Americans as an Italian American now, Rocky leaves the melting pot and he is the true underdog. So then the question is, if after Roots, nobody wanted to be white and everybody wanted to have an ethnic ancestry, what happened if you went into the attic and you tried to find letters from your ancestors, but you couldn't locate an Italian or an Irish or a Swedish grandmother or grandfather? What if you were just white? And so in 1993, Ruth Frankenberg, who's a sociologist, interviewed a number of white women. They were white middle-class women. They were just white Americans. And she said, how do you feel about your identity? And they said, we look in the mirror and we have no mirror image. We have no reflection. We simply don't exist. They said after the civil rights movement, whiteness is only associated with guilt and shame. Nobody wants to hear our story. We simply have no story to tell. And they said, and this is my favorite part, they said whiteness is as bland as Heinz ketchup. Everybody wants to eat ethnic food. Nobody wants ketchup. And they said whiteness is as shapeless as Wonder Bread. Wonder Bread is this bread that you can squish together so it becomes really small. So they said whiteness simply had no shape. It was just nothing at all. And so for me, that's a major moment because it's saying if you have a group of people that say they have no story to tell, nobody cares about them, when does this feeling turn into anger? When does it turn into the idea of having been left behind? And so I want to fast forward from 1993 to 2016, when somebody called J.D. Vance writes a bestseller, and the bestseller is called Hillbilly Elegy. And of course, elegy is important because basically he's saying this group of white people, hillbillies, that are actually looked down upon by the entire nation. They're seen as racist, they're seen as rural, as backwards. And this is an elegy because the country has left them behind. And the subtitle is Memoir of a Family and Culture in Crisis. And this is Vance's own autobiography. So he writes about how he grew up in a trailer park, how his mother was a drug addict, and how he was raised by his grandmother, how he actually worshipped his uncles because his uncles, he said, would defend the honor of their sister and their mother with a gun. And it's a classical American dream story because he said, from a trailer park, he got a stipend, he went to Harvard Law School and, actually made it. Okay, this is before he became vice president, of course. And so Hillbilly Elegy, in a way, echoes Rocky Balboa because Hillbilly Elegy too says the establishment is black. This is the elite. The elite is all ethnic. And basically, Hillbilly Elegy also says America has the wrong creed. We've only been listening to ethnic voices and what happens to white people. And implicitly, Hillbilly Elegy also says, so Ruth Frankenberg interviewed white women. So at least, cynically speaking, they were still women. So they were a minority. In J.D. Vance's book, he basically says masculinity, white masculinity, has been left behind. So his uncles are really his role model, white men who actually, carry a gun and still know what honor is. All of these very, very specific and very problematic implications. And what Hillbilly Elegy does, it's actually saying white men are the true minority. And I want to sort of ask what this means and how did we get there? Okay, and this is my last part, very short. It's another example. This is Jelly Roll, who in 2025, this year, won 2 Grammy Awards. He's a country rap crossover artist. And he's been talking about his own life, how his wife is addicted to fentanyl. He actually testified before Congress saying, how do you feel if you live with somebody who you know is going to die any moment? And he was a drug dealer, went to jail, and was then born again as a rapper and a country singer. And so what is there in his songs, which I'm actually very, very much torn upon. I mean, torn towards, I'll say that. There's something very powerful about his songs. Because he says there's this anger in his songs about having been left behind. in post-industrial America. He's basically saying nobody cares about my story in this post-civil rights America. And a controversy about him was that he met Trump at one of Trump's rallies, and he said that he was touched by Trump. There was something in Trump that resonated with Jelly Roll. And he then, since, there was an uproar, and then he since said, he's unpolitical, but there's something about Trump that he really embraced. And I want to show you a short clip, and that's my last clip, from one of his songs.
I never get lonely. I got these ghosts to keep me company. I took the rear view off of this old Ford, so I only see in front of me. Now the past is out of sight and out of mind. Swore I'd change, now I'm back chasing these white lines. I'm just a long-haired son of a sinner, searching for new ways I can get gone. I'm a pedal to the highway, if you ever wonder why we write these songs. 'Cause I'm only one drink away from the devil. I'm only one call away from home. Yeah, I'm somewhere in the middle. I guess I'm just a little right and wrong.
So what I was fascinated with was that in this clip, faces morph into each other, and they're different ethnicities, they're different genders, and it basically says, the song does, our true problem is addiction. It's not race. It's actually having nowhere to go, being one step away from the next drink and from this hole that you're going to fall into. And Jelly Roll is basically saying, if you're really at the bottom, if you're addicted, if your loved ones are addicted, to speak of white privilege is actually cynical, right? It's not about whiteness. And so he has this other song that I'm not going to play you, where he says, I'm not okay. I just learned to pretend. And so this is a sense, I think, that Trump is able to tap into, this idea of having, feeling like you've been left behind. And so where I'm stuck in this talk, and this is really a sort of impasse, a dead end in my own talk that I'm struggling with, because I feel that there is this story that Jelly Roll is saying, it is telling, and we need to find a place for that story. And it actually has nothing to do with white privilege. But where my point is why is there not a coalition between different stories? So why can't Jelly Roll's story be put down to other stories that may be ethnic, may be gendered? So why can we not have a coalition of voices? And I think that where Trump and J.D. Vance differ from that coalition, where they actually are against such a coalition, is they're saying, in order to hear the fact that they say white men are now the minority, we have to crack down on all other minority voices. So if you suppress the old minority voices, African Americans, Latinx voices, gendered voices, and so on, then white men like J.D. Vance emerge as the true minority. And this is where you have a direct link to book bans, to different versions of history. And I think this is where we're actually stuck and where we're deadlocked. Okay, because if they're saying only if you get rid of the ethnic voices can the white voices emerge as sort of victorious and as being the true minority. Okay, and this is my last part. It's an experiment. Okay, the experiment is, I stole this from the website, so this is supposed to be the library of Uniwersytet Opolski. I hope it is. So my experiment is this. So wherever you are, you need to write down or remember 3 books that you've recently read that you liked most. Okay, 3 books that you read, the topics, 3 courses that you took, or 3 courses that you taught. Okay, So what were the topics? Okay, this is an experiment, so it can also fail. You can also type it into the chat, or you can privately note it down, okay? I can't see you, so I'm hoping that, this is working. So I'll also write mine down, okay? So let's take, I don't know, 2 minutes and write that down. Okay, it's an experiment. Okay, I'm writing it down. You can also write it down on your phone. Okay, ready? Okay, I don't hear anything. Okay, so I assume that hopefully you're ready. Okay. Okay, so
I've just asked students to tap the answers into the chat of the meeting,
Okay.
and it's going to be easier for
okay,
you
that's
to,
perfect.
to see
That's
the
perfect.
answers.
So I don't see the chat. Okay, so okay, so that's even more of an experiment because I don't see what you're typing. Okay, so what I will show you now in a second is actually a list of words, and this is something that Professor Slavik already talked about. This is a list of words that were actually sort of blacklisted, right? So for the National Science Foundation, I'll show you in a second, the National Science Foundation said that if you're applying for funding in the US and your topic is any of the words on the list, then you will not get funding. And if you already have funding, the funding is going to be revoked in retrospect. Okay? So this is what it is. Okay, these are just the beginning. Activism, advocacy, barriers, biases, BIPOC, Black Latinx, diversity, cultural difference. I'll show you some more. Ethnicity, females, gender diversity, also included pregnant people and immigrants. So what I wanted to the experiment was what I'm sort of betting is that in the list of topics that you wrote down, there may be at least one of these blacklisted words. So since I cannot see the chat and I'm worried about running out of time, so in my own case, I was teaching the Hunger Games, which is about gender diversity, so that would be off. I was teaching The Hate You Give, that's about Blackness, so that would not be possible. And I'm writing a book about immigrants who get drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. So in my case, all three would be out. And so maybe that's something that later on we can talk about because I don't see the chat. So I'll just do my conclusion and then maybe that's something we can talk about. I'm very excited about what you've written. So that was the experiment. So this is my conclusion. It's basically saying what Vance and Trump tap into is voices where people argue that they've been left behind, right? They're arguing that this wokeness that surrounds us led to voicelessness. And so the book bans actually started in high school, as you know, but they have then moved on to university. I was checking this morning that it's actually increasingly bans concern universities as well. And needless to say, Roots is on the list of banned books. So Roots changed the way we thought about slavery, changed the way that we thought about whiteness, and it's now banned. And it's actually saying that that part of history needs to disappear, okay? And so where I think, and maybe that is my solution, the point is not about whiteness or blackness, but it's really about intersectionality. It's actually saying, how can we have a more inclusive version of history? And what Trump and Vance are saying is that basically they're saying white people can only tell their story if all the ethnic voices are suppressed. And so we're moving backwards in time. We're moving backwards to a time where actually nobody listens to the other. And that's why we're so polarized. And this is my last slide. Last week, I taught a seminar on young adult fiction. And we did an exhibition at the end. And, the students' families came and their friends came. And each group did their own poster about the book they liked most. And so they did posters on the Hunger Games. This is one of the groups. They gave me permission to use that image. The Hunger Games, The Hate You Give. And at the end of the seminar, we realized that all the books we talked about are now banned, including Harry Potter. And so this is where I'm ending, because I think more than ever, our work in Europe is more important than ever, because there's a saying that we value that most, which we know can be taken away from us. So in the US, this is unbelievable, I think, for me, that my students were saying, so if we become teaching assistants in the US, we wouldn't be able to teach these books. So that's why our role, I think, as people, as scholars, as students, as teachers living in Europe is more important than ever. And I think this is where hope could come from, which is why I'm so happy about this joint event. Thank you. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. Thank you, Mita. Thank you for your great talk. First, I'd like to refer to those to the experiment that Mita was trying to make here, but I can't see any subjects and books.
Yeah, you should scroll up the chat. They were
Up at the bottom of the chat.
not at the bottom, in the middle.
In the
let's
middle.
say.
Okay.
Here, yeah.
Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, Bill Bryson, A Short History of Nearly Everything. I think Bill Bryson may stay. Although, on the other hand, he can be controversial too. You never know with Bill Bryson. And then we have Carlo Rosselli, 7 Brief Lessons on Physics. I hope it's okay. I mean, it should stay. No gender ideology. Apparently, maybe also physics has some gender dimension we don't know about. Yeah, that was very interesting. That was very interesting that those cuts and bans concern so many of us, and that's really appalling. So I wanted to start this second question session, and maybe we'll start from the questions from the chat. So I'm going to mute my microphone. Yes? No, I don't have to.
So Professor Banerjee, should I read the questions from chat, or it is easier to you because you are also able to read the chat?
Yeah,
so
I mean,
maybe...
I can. Would you like me to? I mean, so I think, yeah, because I've read through the chat, and I'll just say something about the question. Is that okay?
Yes, I think that you can choose. You can merge the questions. Yeah. You can address the most interesting. We will only limit you with time if needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just wanted to say I was really excited about the experiment because I didn't know whether people would sort of want to type things into the chat. And for me, what it showed is that, I mean, it's actually the politics, not only do they suppress things, right? I mean, keywords that cannot be used, topics that cannot be used. So obviously, colonialism, enlightenment, immigrant, post-colonialism, I mean, that it's not possible anymore. But what it also does is it pits people against each other. So for instance, if somebody, also, a scholar, an academic, a scientist is writing about physics, then they would still be okay. Even in the humanities, you can do things that would still be okay. So it's actually dividing our communities, A. And then B, it cracks down on the humanities much more, right? Because in science, you're still okay, even though I have colleagues in psychology, and they say, but even if you talk about certain things in psychology, that's also bad, right? I mean, so I think it pits us against each other. It divides our communities. It puts the sciences against the humanities. I mean, it's just, I think it's devastating. And this is where I very much sort of agree with Professor Sławek, who also says, what is our role as people at the university? I mean, it's just devastating. And what I really, really loved is the post about, or the answer on like the course for future kindergarten teachers. So if, I mean, our society has been moving and our societies, even, also in Europe, have becoming more inclusive, right? To teach children, future kindergarten teachers sign language is such a wonderful thing. And the fact that that would now not be possible is just scary to me. I mean, it's just, it's changing our future, right? And the future of our children and so on. And of course, as was also written in the chat, it's on a state level, right? So it divides different states in the US. So people are saying, I mean, if you live in Florida, I mean, that's hard, right? And so I think that it pits different states against each other. And I was at an African American Studies conference yesterday, and they said there's going to be a brain drain because so many people from the US now want to be in Europe because they're saying our academic freedom is compromised. So we're actively looking for European universities to hire us, right? So, I mean, it's a sad occasion, right? That we might actually benefit from this sort of terrible situation. Yes, I think.
Okay, so are we going to ask any specific questions from our room? Okay, there is one person who wanted to ask a question.
So hello, my name is Maya. I am a second year APC student. And so regarding your lecture, my question would be, do you think Trump's dislike of immigrants and his kind of desire to end wokeness and to just end woke, is it somehow connected with this white anger that you discussed? And thank you for the answer.
Yes, I mean, I'm very excited about the question because that was my own central sort of argument that I'm struggling with, because I think the way that Trump is framing it, it's saying the fact that whites have no story to tell anymore is all because of wokeness. So wokeness has made us strangers in our own country. And so this is very much about wokeness. It's actually, and for me, that's something I'm struggling with because actually, as we know from the demographics, ethnic communities too, I mean, he has ethnic voters, right? So it cannot only be about whiteness, but it's also about what he calls wokeness. But then the thing is, everything that we are trying to teach in our universities, at our schools, is about inclusivity, right? And Professor Slavik talked about, DEI policies. So we would say it's inclusivity, but to label all that wokeness is sort of a major ideological attack. And it's actually cynical, I think, because it's not that, nobody teaches about different versions of history. I mean, to say ethnic voices are now all in power is itself an ideological construct, which is not true simply. But to stylize, Trump is stylizing himself as a minority. And that's just, I mean, I think it's cynical, right? Because he's not an underdog by any means. But this is the sort of the agenda that I think he's driving. Yeah, so I very much agree about wokeness as a new enemy. And you can also type questions into the chat. I forgot to say.
Okay, we have another person from our university. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Benjamin Golec, and I'm a second year most recent American elections. The situation of politics being sort of like a my name is Benjamin. I'm a second year EPC student, and I'll repeat my question because we were able to notice within the last few American elections the situation of the politics being sort of like a pendulum, in the fact that Mr. Donald Trump won the 2016 election, then there was the election afterwards, and now this one again, going back to those kind of political standpoints. And I'm wondering if the speakers here do think that that will be still continuing that trend of kind of coming back and forth between these two kind of opposing sides, or that this current situation is kind of a part of a trend that might last more than one election? That's kind of my question right now for the people here. Thank you.
So this was to both of us, right? To Professor Slavik and myself.
Yes.
So I think if I can answer shortly by a small anecdote. So the first time Trump was elected, I was teaching a course on climate justice. So the next day, so Trump was elected the first time. Next day, I had a class on climate justice and social justice. And there was this very sort of tall white male student in my class, and he gets up. I mean, you cannot see that, but I'm very, very short. And so he's about twice my height. He gets up in class and he comes very close to me and he says, "You terrorized us with your discourse about social justice, and now it's payback." And he said, and I was like up against the wall, right? Because I was backing up. And he's like, "Now I'm going to pay you back. And you actually hate white men." And I said, I didn't know what to say. So I said, "But my husband is white and I like him." And so now looking back, I think I want to go back in time and I want to tell my younger self, this was years ago, right? I should have talked, because there's something in that anger that obviously, I mean, even the class was polarized and I didn't know, but I didn't have the words to talk about it. And I think because of, I agree with what you're saying. I think it's going to go back and forth unless we find a way to talk about why our societies are so polarized. Like I have some of my good friends are saying immigrants should not be in Germany. And okay, look at me. I mean, obviously I have what in Germany they call an immigrant background. So I think we have to find a way about to just make sort of mend these gaps, because I think it's just deadlocked. Otherwise it's going to swing back and forth. But we have to find a way to solve it. And I wish I knew how. Yes, but I'll leave that to Professor Slavik.
Okay. I think, well, partly this is the fragment, of course, of a larger problem, which I think we'll be maybe able to comment a little bit better when we start concluding our session. I've made some points about most essential and most urgent issues that have been raised. But I don't really want to come with it right now, since maybe some other questions surely will be coming up. So let's not conclude yet, but maybe I'm sure are there any questions? Probably there are some other questions coming. So Mita, I'll be back to this and I'm making notes, so I'll be back to most of these issues, at least some of these issues, in our brief resume session. Right. Anytime you actually, it's your call whether you have any questions or not.
So I could, I mean, that's, I think, I mean, if I can't see Pavel, Professor Marcinkiewicz.
Yes, I'm here. I'm behind the pulpit.
So is that okay? So I could talk about some of the questions in the chat?
Yeah, I think that's okay. We are going to make a conclusion in a moment, but those questions that we want you to ask now are directly connected with Professor Mity Banerjee's lecture. So this is not a conclusion yet of the whole workshop.
So I think so one of the talks, one of the questions in the chat is that also happening in Europe? And I mean, I can only speak for Germany, and that's why I would love to know what people, for instance, in Poland, but also other European countries are thinking. In Germany, it's exactly the same. I mean, the German AfD, right-wing German party, Alternative for Germany, has campaigns where actually they show a white pregnant German woman with her white male, German partner, and they're saying, Germans, we make them ourselves. So this is a campaign against immigrant men, essentially, saying they're taking away our women. So it's very much about masculinity. And my favorite line is by sad, right? I mean, sad line is that there's a white male politician by this right-wing party, and he says real men don't drink latte macchiato, right? They drink straight coffee. And so this is very much about masculinity, and it's actually very, very similar. And that's, for me, what is so frightening. That actually, and the student who came up to me after Trump's first election, he was saying the Trump election is inspiring him in Germany, right? And so I think it's all sadly connected. The second question, do you think that there's a way to stop Trump? Yeah. Yes, I wish I think it's really about the academic institutions. It's like, are they going to fight back, right? I mean, so, and this is very much speaks to us, all of us too. And actually, Europe could be, have a leading role here, because as now Europe is pressuring the US because science and academics are like international, right? So now, people, I know the German, specific disciplines in the German Academy of Science, they've written letters, open letters to Trump, saying that's a crackdown on knowledge, on universities as we know them. So that should be taken back. So to the extent that we will create an alliance, such as FORTHEM, right? So that could also be for our conclusion. I mean, FORTHEM is an alliance. And we, each of us, asking ourselves, is Europe the same or different, as the US? Do we have similar movements or polarizations in European countries? So I think it's very much also about us. And that's that's a chance. That's a huge opportunity. Does it make sense to end? Yes. And so about the dialogue with my student, I think it's true. I think that's what I should have done. I'm trying to do, because I found myself so shocked by this anger and by this aggression that I didn't know what to say. But I should have found a way to talk, because otherwise, if we're not talking, and that's what I'm just stuck in, right? But so even, and I was saying, I'm an academic, but I'm also a person, right? And so some of my friends embrace, I mean, they're not right wing, but they have similar ideas that maybe there's too much immigration in Germany. And then some of my other friends have said, just stop being friends with them. These can't be your friends. But I'm thinking it's more complicated than that. And so obviously I have to find a way to communicate in a way that doesn't feel to them like I'm censoring them, right? And this is, Professor Slavik said in his talk, when do we go too far, right? Like, is there a way in which political correctness has gone too far? And it's an honest question that I'm also asking myself, because if I can't make my friends, my colleagues, or my students see that it's all about inclusion, it's not about censorship. But if they don't see it that way, if they feel excluded, if they feel censored, then I have to find a different way of communicating. And I think that's our biggest challenge in all of our countries, I think. Yes.
Thank you for your informative answers. Any other questions from the room? Well, I wanted to briefly relate to the part of Professor Banerjee's presentation connected with the mini-series Roots. I don't know if you are aware that it was extremely popular in Poland at the beginning of the 1980s, and especially during the martial law, because in this way, the communist regime criticized the United States in general, and also slavery, of course, was a great example of American degeneration that was totally evil and typically American. So I remember that I was perhaps 12 years old when I watched Roots, and it was one of a few very small number of American series was present in Poland, and Roots was extremely popular as a series. But I think that what I missed in your presentation is a clearer definition of whiteness. Because it seems that we have very precise definitions of various types of ethnicity, while whiteness is a little bit amorphic and vague.
Right.
So could you please elaborate on this? So what exactly, are there any shades of whiteness?
Right. I think, I mean, that's a wonderful point. And the point is actually, you know, of course, very well taken, because I think that is at the heart of also of the debate, because I think it's true that also in the debates in sort of in ethnic studies, feels like ethnic studies, whiteness was precisely this vague moment that nobody really knew how to define, right? And then Ruth Frankenberg said white women, but then whiteness seems this amorphous, you know, sort of concept that is actually only now increasingly seen to be heterogeneous. And then there's two questions. One is, for instance, in Europe, in Germany, whiteness would actually not be a concept, right? So the question is, can that be applied to other societies, including European societies? But even in the US, I think it's been wrong. It's actually, to some extent, been wrongly used to homogenize groups of people that are actually internally heterogeneous. And so I think the answer would be to actually move beyond this opposition between blackness and whiteness and to ask, how is each of these communities positioned? And so I think, but for me, that's an ongoing, you know, question, because many people have said whiteness has been synonymous with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? This WASP culture. But I think it's important to actually say, what is the role of whiteness in terms of dominance, but also how can dominance not be reduced to race? Because I think we have to look at class, we have to look at different, really intersectional identities. So I think I agree. I agree that that's what we have to define. But I also, you know, my own work has looked at how, for instance, in the US, you could become a citizen from the very beginning, only if you were defined as white. And that's a major moment in US history, because nobody knew what it meant to be white. But still, you could become a citizen only as a free white person. So whiteness is both very powerful, and as you're saying, it cannot really be defined. So that's also something I think that we need to sort of talk about.
Thank you very much for your answer. Well, I think it's a good moment for a conclusion, and I wanted both our keynote speaker to summarize briefly what we've learned today, or perhaps we didn't learn much, but there are a few points that we can highlight and take with us as helpful for the nearest future, as helpful science, or as helpful knowledge for the nearest future. So, Professor Sławek, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mita. And of course, it's a hard task to summarize a discussion like this, where you have so many problems and so many different shades of problems, like you have so many shades of whiteness. But I'll try to do my best. One of the things which we have been discussing, although we used Trump's America as a case study, but paradoxically we used, and I think Mita mentioned it before, a few minutes ago, that in fact we're talking Trump and America, but in fact we're looking at the mirror in which we see ourselves. So in other words, we are discussing America as a mirror in which we see our problems and how we are going to these problems, how we're going to react to these problems, how we're going to take and how we are going to brave these difficult challenges. So, in other words, while discussing America, we are discussing ourselves. And of course, this has already happened culturally because, as well, I'm talking to people who study German language, so you're obviously aware of the German group Rammstein. And Rammstein many years ago saying we are living in America, and for Paris steht Mickey Mouse, and so on and so forth. So culturally, we all live in America. Now the question is asked, and Trump indirectly made us ask this question. What does it mean that we live in America? And can we, and do we really want to live in America? Mita has very rightly drew our attention to certain phenomena of popular culture, like this hillbillies rapper, Jerry Roll. And in fact, that's very informative. One of the lessons which we can use, for example, in class, is to look at how popular culture reflects these problems. You can look at, for example, at the phenomenon of Taylor Swift on the one hand, who officially supported Kamala. And you can look, on the other hand, at people like Jerry Roll, who supported the other party, and see how these texts of these people discuss vital issues, how they are reflected in what Taylor Swift writes or in what Roll writes or sings in his song. Historically, I think you can go back to great rockers like, paradigmatic American rocker like Bruce Springsteen, of course, who wrote songs like This Is My Hometown, describing the collapse of post-industrial American cities like Detroit. My Hometown is a great song. But I noticed that one of the questions used the word revenge. Are we about revenge? What is going to happen? Are we discussing, or are we looking for motivation and for ways to take our revenge? Of course not. And I'm thinking, once again, looking for inspiration in popular culture. And I'm turning to Cornel West, great American historian and philosopher, I think Yale or Harvard, a person, Afro-American, who in fact wants us to listen to American blues, original blues, like Johnson, Blind Lemon Jefferson, and great American Delta blues singers. And he sees blues as American response to tragedy like slavery. The word slavery was used many times today. He says blues is a great American response to slavery because it's about mourning, it's about sadness, it's about despair, but it's never about revenge. You will find no motif of revenge in the blues. So one of the conclusions, Mita finished with a good idea of experiment. What sort of experiment you could perform in class would be just to take original American 1930s, 1940s blues, like Johnson, for example. You can say Taylor Swift. You can say Bruce Springsteen, and you can say Jerry Roll, and see what sort of spectrum comes up and what sort of problems, how these problems emerged out of these songs. In other words, what we are trying to do, we are trying, in a sense, paradoxically, to reinvent Europe as America, in a sense that, America started as a great adventure. America started as a great adventure, of course. Statue of Liberty had come, no longer, of course, but originally Statue of Liberty had come. This is a quotation from John Lennon's famous song, New York City. No, Statue of Liberty never stopped saying welcome. But now, how can we? I'm going back to notions. One of you asked questions about immigrants and immigration, about these issues. We have to rethink Europe along this line as a place of hospitable welcome, which is not an easy thing to do, because the notion of safety and security, and this is, of course, a crucial and important concept which we need to discuss. So if we were to compose a dictionary of urgent terms, security would come as an important issue, surely. But it does not exclude, it does not exempt us from the necessity of thinking about hospitality. What is the relationship between hospitality and security? Let's ask ourselves a very honest question. To what extent we use the notion of security as a smoke screen which covers up our negligence, our reluctance to accept people coming from outside, from different religions, different dresses, different cuisine, and blah, 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 blah. Okay? So we need to focus on these important notions, hospitality and security, and how to make these two notions work together somehow, and in this way to restructure Europe as an adventure. And of course, I'm using adventure in a good sense, as a kind of positive energy, joy, Freude, jouissance, and so on and so forth. And that's up to you folks. We are moving out. We are dying. You are coming. Okay, next thing was words, language. We should never dismiss language. And one of the lessons of this meeting is that we should be very careful about the language which we use, but also the language that is being used and directed and addressed to us. One of the notions, for example, it is a very tricky notion, is the notion like, for example, what happens on American campuses, or for that matter, on Polish campuses, if you raise the issue of Gaza. Nearly 50,000 Palestinians were killed by Israeli bombings. Now, you come out and you protest and you are immediately called an anti-Semite. This is what's happening in America. I wonder whether you are aware. I'm quoting from the article from New Yorker, which I already mentioned, March 10th, something which is called doxing policy. The doxing policy on American campuses is their way of listing people who protest against Israeli bombings of Gaza, taking photographs and nicknaming them anti-Semites. Now, of course, concept of anti-Semitism is a very dramatic concept with tragic, profound history in Europe, not only in Europe, but particularly dramatic in Europe for obvious reasons that we don't have to go back to right now. We know, we remember. But I think it's vitally important to pay attention to these notions and do not accept them as labels which automatically classify people as belonging to this or that group, which you can evidently, which politicians love to do because that makes the job of opposing one group to another group very easy and very simple. So language is a very delicate instrument. And this is exactly what we should be aware all the time. And it's the job and the task of humanities, of a part of the university. And that's partly why humanities are very badly targeted now by Trump's administration. So that would be another conclusion from today's session. Beware of language, because language shapes, configurates, calibrates the world in which we live. Next notion, we spoke about immigrants and hospitality. And security. This is a very interesting list of concepts which need to be put in a dialogue with one another. Of course, another thing was associated with whiteness and various shades of whiteness. Now, interestingly enough, this is very important as it could be used as a case study of how politicians love to incessantly divide people. To introduce, with bad intention, of course, differences between people so that they could be used and played in their political games and tricks. Let me give you an example from the same article, March 10th, the New Yorker. This is about the lawsuit which was filed against Starbucks. We all know Starbucks, of course. It was I'm quoting now. It was filed by the Missouri Attorney General alleging that its workforce, that is to say people who work for Starbucks, is, and I'm qualified, less qualified because it has become more female and less white. That's very interesting. Less white and more female, as if female were kind of blackness. As John Lennon probably reminded me of it, used to famously sing, "Woman is the nigger of the world." Now, that's a very interesting division, because this qualification is that this workforce is less qualified because it is female and not enough white. Makes you aware of the situation, how deeply these divisions can go, that even if you are female and white, you would still be considered to be not quite white. Which evidently speaks about what the author of this article calls white supremacy. And that's a nice footnote to Mita's speech about whiteness. Maybe it's about anger, which could be justified, white anger could be justified, but the next step would be white supremacy, which is, of course, a very dangerous thing. And I think we are on the way, Trump's administration is on the way towards white supremacy. Step forward, one step, very dangerous step, made forward from anger to supremacy, which, of course, opens a very dramatic, a chapter with possibly very dramatic consequences. I'm looking at this article trying to answer also and address other questions like, what shall we do today at the universities? And of course, you realize that American universities are under pressure now. Out of 8 Ivy League universities, I think 6 had to change their presidents recently because they couldn't cope with pressures, and they were accused of various forms of support given to what administration calls wokeness, and so on and so forth. So one of the conclusions of this article is, I'm quoting, "I think it's time for the universities for courageous leadership." And I'm emphasizing courageous leadership because it then sends us back to what we spoke about 2 hours ago. And remember, John Mill in mid-19th century was saying we need moral courage. And I think this is time for moral courage everywhere. And of course, America could be used. What's happening to American, or possibly could be happening to American universities, is a great warning signal. And talking about warning, one of the conclusions of our meeting today could be that humanities, universities generally speaking, but humanities could be an early warning system. Reading text attentively, trying to understand attentively, you can warn people, we can warn the society of what's coming, what's happening, and what possibly could be coming. So humanities as an early warning system, which is a military term, I think, that I apologize for, nevertheless could be used as a description of what humanities stands for in the society. And maybe drawing to a close, I think you could also speak about we were also saying about education, many things about education, which is, of course, an enormously important topic that needs, of course, a full-time discussion, which we're not able to do today. But certainly, something sort of a conclusion could be that actually the beauty of education, which is something that I think politicians are not very likely to see and appreciate. The beauty of education is that it is a risky enterprise, so to speak. That if you are, and I'm going back to the beginning of our meeting today when I was trying to bring back to your attention the fact that freo in Anglo-Saxon meant both free and joyful, okay? So if education is to be an opportunity given to people to become autonomous and critically thinking individuals who are not schizoid individuals, that is to say, locked within themselves and the stories of their own success. Success is another word worth discussing. But that are open to social relationships, then education is a risky thing. We never know what's going to happen in education. Whereas, the bureaucracy of education wants you to know. Pavel, who is an administrator, I used to be an administrator. So as you know, one of the points of paperwork behind education is to present sort of like the vision of the graduate. What you expect the graduate to be? No, this is sheer bureaucracy. How are you supposed to know? I mean, education is a beautiful risk. And I'm quoting the title of the book by Geert Bista, who is the Dutch philosopher, who is the leading philosopher of modern day education. So if the bureaucracy is a beautiful risk which you have to take, that opens another perspective on what's going to happen in the future, which is, of course, future is in many respects up to you to decide what you would like it to be. Well, that's probably, well, I don't know to what extent, Pavel, one of the final points would be that I know that I'm going probably to become extremely unpopular after I say this. But again, I'm an old man, I can take it. Whether one of the reasons is not to go back to certain texts and reread them carefully, reread them attentively. This text must be maybe old, mid-19th century, maybe 19th century, but they still carry the message. We are still surprised when we read Greek tragedies today. I mean, they knew everything practically, and they said it in a way which is shattering in a sense, because it's so pertinent, so to the point, so clear, so lucid. So maybe one of the merits and one of the tasks which we have forgotten about is the ability to read attentively with clarity, without claiming that we already know, but being on the way to knowledge, only on the way, never claiming that we do know finally. And maybe that would be my conclusive remark, which may be totally wrong. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. You may do it in private if you don't want to do it publicly, but that will be my...
Thank you, Professor, for your brilliant conclusion. And now, Professor Banerjee, a few words, if you could, as a conclusion.
Yeah, I'm actually, a couple of things struck me. It's one, as I said at the beginning, that Professor Sławek and I had actually very similar responses. We drew on different texts. So I talked more about popular culture and he talked about philosophy, but we're both actually saying the humanities have never been more important, right? I mean, this is not to say that the sciences or other fields, social sciences, natural sciences are not as important, but it's saying the humanities have something very specific to offer. And for me, in two ways. One is because if we go back, as Professor Sławek said, in history, and we see how other crises have been solved, we have these foundational texts, right? Because people also wrote in the text that, in the chat, for instance, that banning, if we hear book banning, obviously we're going to think of the Nazis banning books, right? And we're going to go back to Hannah Arendt's work, and what does it mean to actually just erase or try to erase certain epistemologies and so on. So I think we need to go back to foundational texts, but also, as I was trying to say, cultural texts can, especially popular culture, because it targets a mass audience, can also tell us about anxieties that are actually in society, anxieties about being a stranger in your own country, whatever that means. So I think these are very important points. And for me, going back to what Professor Marcinkiewicz said about roots, I mean, these texts have been used in Europe for very different ends. It was the same as in the German Democratic Republic. They also said that racism existed in the US, which is very anti-American at the time, right, during the Cold War, but it didn't exist, for instance, in East Germany. That's what was argued, right? Which was not true. So I think for me, one of the, well, it's not a solution, right? But the most fascinating thing for me is how we can actually have a dialogue between categories that exist in the US and in Europe, because Europe is going to talk about whiteness, for instance, in different ways than in the US, but there may be overlaps. And I think that one thing that is urgent also, if I can relate to the For Them Alliance, I think bringing together different European cultures has never been more urgent. So what is happening on a political scale, that people are saying now we need, I don't know, funding on an EU level to sort of support Ukraine and so on. This is something for us to spell out. What does it mean for our universities? What kind of coalition can we have? And how can we join forces with coalitions in the US, also at an academic level, right? So For Them could be a nucleus, because this is also happening in our country. It's happening in Italy. It's happening, the similar polarizations are happening all over Europe. And I think for me, Poland has been one of the shining examples where a country has actually, turned back from, a certain polarization and actually, moved towards a different path. And so this is the question: as Europeans, what can we learn from each other? And I think I think in that sense, I would agree that Europe is an experiment more than ever, because we can now say we want to be an alternative to what is happening in the US. We have to sort of make sure that our societies do not become quite as polarized. And I think this is something that we could also, For Them, I don't mean to sort of impose anything on For Them, but for me, this joint event has actually been wonderful, because I think our countries, the more that we're in dialogue with each other, the more we can offer, both on a sort of personal level as teachers, as students, but also what does that mean for our field? And I think for me, there couldn't have been sort of a better credo coming out of this workshop.
Thank you very much, Professor Banerjee. I think I'm going to close the event right now. I wanted to thank those people who contributed to the event most, especially Nicole Berkel from the For Them Alliance, and Alexandra Krems, with whom I wrote so many letters about the technicalities of today's meeting. Thank you, all of you, for participation. And I hope this is just a beginning of a fruitful cooperation, and that we managed to shatter certain despondency that was hovering over humanities, as trying to label us as powerless. No, we can change things, and this is something that we've learned today. Thank you very much, and hope to see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mita.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.